It's very important to read these kinds of works, because once you know who the greats are, well, then you can easily spot the faux version. There's so many voices in the world. Read the masters. When you've digested the meaning and the depth of what they say, hey, the job of finding out who's the Judas or just half-baked truth becomes very obvious. Read the masters, because then you save the world from your ignorance. You know, there's a statement, isn't there? The man who does not like to read is the equal of one who cannot read. And then, as we showed in the trailer, highly recommended works of the psychologist Thomas Szasz, The Myth of Mental Illness. I emphasize these people because I believe it's monumentally important when it comes to solutions. And what I'm going to say now, you should listen to like you've never listened to anything else in your life. Because it's very, very important for the people you know, for yourself, and for the people that you're going to meet every day, especially in the coming years. Because everybody's talking about breakdown, everybody's talking about losing the thread, everybody's talking about their depressions. What happens if those depressions, if those feelings of futility, anxiety, whatever, are the closest you or that person have ever been to true selfhood? But that part of the mind, conditioned by all this pestilence that we've been talking about, is making you think that it's not. What happens if your depression is your best friend and your greatest teacher? And we went into this in the 2012 talk in Los Angeles. Mentioned it in brief. What happens if your tragedy, your pain, your anxiety, your angst is the closest you have ever come, or that person who's giving you those problems, that laundry list of how they can't handle it, can't keep the job, can't keep the marriage, as if that's all normal? They can't find the harmony and the normality in an abnormal, deeply sick world? Do you know that the door to reality, the gate, is incredibly narrow? I don't want to become biblical with you here. I don't want to preach a sermon, but the way out of this maze is extremely narrow. It's very hard. We're talking very serious stuff here. And we have to turn around, right, and re-examine a lot of what we've been told, even by a lot of the psychologists and the doctors and the so-called experts. What happens if those dark voices that you think are so alien and so foreign and so ghastly are actually there because this is the first time in your life that you've actually even approached the shrine of your own selfhood, your own aloneness, your own stillness? But the chorus of all that other stuff and all the chorus of the experts has you completely thinking the opposite. And so it's big pharma now, and it's drugs, and it's futility, and it's even suicide. Or it's immersion in all the other falseness of the world, thinking that you're now returned to sanity. Now, Heidegger already said this about our consciousness, the inauthentic and the authentic man. Because the pain and the so-called tragedy that comes with authenticity has its own beauty. It's in the running away from all of these aspects of yourself that's when the problems arise. In talks of people like myself, we're forever pointing out that there's an external adversary. We just spent 2 hours doing it. But the negotiation of that external adversary and all of its elements and all of its arsenal is really only 50% of the extraction process. It's a very valuable aspect. But as a matter of fact, there are 2 demons that stand between you and the road of selfhood or the road of truth. 2 demons, and one is the internal adversary. So those who leave that aspect out, leave out the psychology, are only helping you somewhat, because you have the external adversary to fend off and become aware of and study and disempower, but you also have this thing inside yourself, the mind, the ego, the conditioning. You see, all the vices that they put there. The anti-psychologists are basically telling you, look, you think that if you live in this world, being a self is almost considered a disease. Well, as a matter of fact, it is. The search for your own selfhood has become the ultimate disease. So everything else that leads you away from selfhood has been endorsed by the world. And so now the world is screaming for down with Big Brother, you know, and Illuminati must be destroyed. Because we understand that the people who are working behind the world, who control the world, are sick. They're demented, they're psychopathic. And in fact, as I've said before, they are the beings that are holding civilization back. But just as on a social level, right, these destroyers, these sorcerers, they hold society, they hold culture, they hold civilization back. How can you fight them when their poison is in your head and your thought processes is holding you back? You see how it works on the microcosmic and the macrocosmic level? If your thinking has identified with the master, then your own development and progress is stunted and arrested. Isn't it almost a paradox to believe that you can run out then in the social world and bring down this other higher pestilence? It's a reciprocal relationship between your own mind and your own thought patterns and your own strength or lack of it and what is going on in the social domain. But before we can get deeply into the solutions, we've got to start at the beginning. You begin at the beginning again. Trauma, ancient trauma. Everything you see today, everything that's made by mind, everything that's made by thought is a manifestation of ancient trauma, which we've gone into at great length in other works. Paul Shepard, an activist and commentator on this problem, in his book A Kind of Madness, says the change to a more hostile stance towards nature began between 5,000 and 10,000 years ago and became more destructive and less accountable with the progress of civilization. In hindsight, this change has been explained in terms of necessity or as the decline of ancient gods. But more likely it was an irrational, though not unlogical, and unconscious, a kind of failure in some fundamental dimension of human existence. An irrationality beyond mistakenness, a kind of madness. So here we are, we're conscious. We talked last time about the weight of that and the bittersweetness of it, the fact that man has consciousness that maybe other forms of life don't have. Theodosius Dobzhansky, the geneticist, says that self-awareness and foresight brought the awesome gifts of freedom and responsibility. Man feels free to execute some of his plans and to leave others in abeyance. He feels the joy of being the master of the world and of himself. But the joy is tempered by the feeling of responsibility. Man knows that he is accountable for his acts. He has acquired the knowledge of good and evil. This is a dreadfully heavy load to carry. No other animal has to withstand anything like it. There is a tragic discord in the soul of man. So in various ways, these experts have noticed this conflict, this diremption in the human psyche. Partly to do with this fact that we can think about meaning, we can think about life, we can think about thought. And we can also hold our actions, we can feel responsible for our actions, which brings out guilt and shame and accountability and all sorts of things. We can also think about the future. We have temporal consciousness. We saw these quotes before by Jung. He said that consciousness is a very recent acquisition of nature and that it is still in an experimental state. It is frail, menaced by specific dangers and easily injured. As anthropologists have noted, one of the most common mental derangements that occur among primitive people is what they call the loss of a soul. And he goes on to say that I'm not denying that great gains have resulted from the evolution of civilized society, but these gains have been made at the price of enormous losses, whose extent we have scarcely begun to estimate. Now I would stop there, you see, and the rest of this presentation is basically a question of losses? What losses? Let's get into that. What do you mean when you say that the gains are, well, we have something over here that's really good, but you say that it's been gained at the price of enormous losses? I'd like to know what those are. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the investigation of that will lead us to the heart of the problem. The kind of consciousness we have, as I said, that type of interiority, right, that subjectivity that came with the trauma, because as Julian Jaynes and others have shown, you didn't have a consciousness of yourself. You didn't have a feeling of what you might call selfhood. You didn't have that feeling, I am a separate identity, all through the centuries. That is a recent concept. And of course, the animals of the world, they don't have quite that same type of consciousness. But at the same time, they are directly piped into what is real. Nature and their minds are plugged in, because they're not sitting there worrying about their death and worrying about their actions and all the other stuff that we humans are involved with. Right? Scientists have tried to reduce it and go, well, they just have instinct, without even really telling you what that is or where it comes from. No, instinct is the fact that they are governed by the ordinances of nature, which they also obey. We have lost touch of that. We don't obey it, they do. The great teacher Alan Watts said that nothing so eludes conscious inspection as consciousness itself. This is why the root of consciousness has been called, paradoxically, the unconscious. Now that's very interesting. It pertains to the divisions that exist within consciousness. We don't even, in our definition of consciousness, we have to admit that it's divided or subdivided. Right brain, left brain, right? Mammalian, limbic, frontal, etc. Or conscious, unconscious. That's very interesting. Is that part of the trauma? Because we saw with the mind control concepts, yes it is. Splitting the mind also involves multiple personalities, dividing in order to be able to control. So have we done that? Are we victims in that same sense? Where the house is like a mansion with many rooms, some with the light on and some without?